Welcome everyone to our first videocast session of the Schaufler Lab Spring Term 2025, featuring guest speaker Tobias Revell. My name is Niklas Egberts. I'm a PhD researcher at the Schaufler Lab. Since April 2024, the Schaufler Lab is connecting diverse research efforts under the guiding theme of data worlds, socio-technical and cultural syntheses of new realities. Data worlds points towards the recursive and generative relationship between data and emerging life worlds. Social networks, smart cities, cyber wars, AI art, climate modeling, and digital healthcare are all examples of how big data and digital technologies are transforming politics, human relations, science, and the environment. In order to better understand the digitally mediated environments and how they shape contemporary life, it is necessary to critically investigate their infrastructures and practices. With great pleasure, I announce our speaker, Tobias Revell. Revell is an artist, designer, researcher, and educator from London who specializes in futures and technology through critical practice. He's the Design Futures Lead at Arup, where he leads the foresight team in delivering large-scale strategic futures and sustainability projects and developing futures literacy across the firm. Tobias Revell specializes in the use of design approaches to deepen engagement, enhance the quality of outcomes, and question underlying assumptions in tackling complex problems. He exhibits, writes, and lectures internationally on futures, art, design, technology, and imagination. Currently, he is completing a PhD in design at Goldsmiths on design and the construction of AI, which explores the different ways that design is implicated in reciprocating mainstream myths, tropes, and imaginaries of AI, and how critical practitioners use different creative strategies to trouble, disrupt, and introduce alternatives to the mainstream. Revell's work critically and speculatively investigates the world-making qualities of emerging technologies. The question of what worldviews shape particular data practices and how these practices in turn perpetuate specific worldviews lies at the heart of Revell's practice and are central to the Data Worlds program at the Schaufler Lab. Again, a brief note on today's session. This is recorded. Tobias will talk for 15 to 20 minutes. Afterwards, we will enter a moderated discussion. And after the moderated discussion, we will we'll stop the recording and then enter an open discussion within the colleague. Thank you for joining us, Tobias. With this, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's always like profoundly strange hearing your bio read out. It's like you've died and someone else is saying what you did in your life. Hello, everyone. It is I, Tobias Revell, coming to you from London's famous London. Let me just share my screen. And thank you so much, Niklas, for the invite and for the introduction as well. So yeah, we've got about 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and talk really quickly, mostly with a focus on my PhD work. So you mentioned some of my sort of roles there and some of the things I get up to. My main day job is I'm Design Futures Lead here at Arup. Arup is a global engineering consultancy of about 18,000 people around the world. And I lead the foresight team, and our work is about helping our clients and our colleagues understand how long-term change over the next 10, 30, 50, even 100 years impacts, everything from aviation to climate resilience to energy systems, whatever it is. So that's my day job. Before that, I was a fully fledged academic. I ran a program at University Arts London in interaction design. I'm also doing my PhD at Goldsmiths, which is largely what I'm going to talk about here, and is largely the subject of this, but it's related also to some of the work I've done with Haunted Machines, which is a curatorial project that I've been running for forever. And I'm going to talk about some of my artworks as well, which are part of my PhD, because I'm doing a practice-based PhD. So it's about the relationship between the sort of literature and the ideas and theories I'm looking at in particularly in social and technological studies, but also in the practice of other designers, but then relating that to my own practice and trying out some of those ideas through my own practice. So the name of my PhD thesis is Design in the Social Construction of Artificial Intelligence. And normally I'd have with a bit more time, I'd talk about what that means. But essentially, I'm coming from the position that AI as a thing is socially constructed. So it's a kind of imaginary made of, yes, real world technology and science and mathematics, but also science fiction, marketing, policy, video games, performances, spectacles, product demos. All sorts of things are in that grab bag that construct this idea of AI. So it's a socially constructed thing that responds to and create social needs and fears and anxieties. And so my interest is, okay, what's the role of design in that social construction? So how is design used or implicated in telling stories about AI, telling world building around AI, but also as a critical practice and challenging those. And I'll talk about some of those projects I've been doing that are trying to challenge the mainstream imaginaries using design. So the thesis is in three main parts, and I'm just going to sort of really quickly, breeze through them as quickly as I can, because obviously I'm trying to summarize about 7 years work in 10 minutes. It's a bit tricky. So the first section is on use, usefulness, and users. So this is this idea that the usefulness and users have to be made up for a technology, and this is part of social constructivism as well. Most technologies don't solve a pre-existing problem. They emerge as a kind of accident or a coincidence, and then a use and an application and a social value is invented for them afterwards. The story that is most commonly studied about this is Trevor Pynchon v. Biker's study of the bicycle tire as the original example of a thing that didn't really have a purpose before it became associated with safety and speed in the 1880s. The second chapter is on spectacle and demonstration and performance. So it's how showmanship, performance, storytelling is used to socially construct AI. And then the final chapter is on the uncanny and enchantment. So this idea of things that are somewhat otherworldly or strange or unusual, either in the technology or in the people that could socially construct AI as well. So I'm going to really try and quickly breeze through these different sections and some examples from them. So the first thing, as I said, is we, and I'm also thinking about my professional context as a consultant here, often assume that there's a kind of predestined, inevitable story of technological development. Langdon Winner calls it autonomous technology, that somehow it already, in this example, the idea of the smartphone was already in the ether, if you like. It was already in the world. It just had to be created by the right kind of technological genius. But you can look at almost any technology and you'll find a story that's a little bit like this. A couple of interesting ideas are pulled together: cellular communication, screens, text. And then, there's a couple of years in the case of the mobile phone where people aren't really sure, what it's for, who it's for, and therefore the design of it reflects that uncertainty. So this is just a great collection of early cell phones from the 1990s that reflect this fact that design hadn't really settled on who was using these devices, what were they using them for, how, what was important about the design of those devices, what had to be prioritized. We now, have largely settled around this as the design, no matter the brand, it's sort of something like this. But for a while, there was all these different things as people were trying to figure out, what was this new thing and how should it go into society and how should it be used? I mean, the sort of the critical design story of this, if you like, is that it was a device that was largely designed to go in people's pockets, and those people were largely men because early mobile phones were bought on lease by large companies for their employees. And in the 1990s and 1980s, the white collar workplace is male dominated. And so they end up with this form factor because that's the sort of primary audience at the time. So an interesting speculation that I've run before is, well, what would have happened if we had a female dominated workplace, for example? How would the mobile phone have looked instead if it hadn't been designed for suit pockets? And then the particular thing with AI, as I'm sure anyone who's following the literature and the sort of the discourse would know, is that there is a lot of uncertainty. And I'm referring in this example to the latest wave of generative AI, and my work looks right back to the 60s. There is an uncertainty about what this thing is for. And so one of the really interesting kind of concepts I've seen quite a lot, and this is the example of Figma, is a relatively new idea that it's the role of the users to figure out what it's for. So this is Figma saying, oh, as designers, it's up to you to figure out how to use AI. I had a very tense conversation with a senior person from IBM last year where they were basically saying that it required courage and curiosity to make AI work. And I sort of said, well, surely as the people selling it, that's your job to make it work, not the people who are buying it. But they didn't seem to agree with that. So there's also this thing of like, we don't really know what it's for, but we're going to release it to the world and you're going to figure it out. And I remember at the chat GPT moment, having followed GPT-2 and stuff like that, the argument being made by OpenAI was that the only way to develop it further was to put it in the world and see what people did with it. So it's very much this idea that's in this chapter as well, that the boundaries of the laboratory and the experimental area in which science can be done is extended to be the whole world. The whole world becomes a test bed for this technology and these series of ideas that are associated with it. Another aspect of creating use is having to associate it with things that people that people see as real problems. So these are stills from two pretty notable documentaries about some significant AI advances in the last 20 years. One from the AlphaGo documentary from DeepMind, which is both of these are on YouTube, by the way, and they're completely fascinating. The AlphaGo documentary where DeepMind built a Go playing machine that beat Lee Sedol, the then reigning world champion at Go. And then IBM researchers film about Watson, which was their AI they developed to win at the US game show Jeopardy. And in both of these films, they have a narrative in which the machine overcomes the adversity of the game. And I'll get back to that in the spectacle and performance part as well. But then at the end, they always say, well, okay, yeah, it's won this game, but the significance is now we can have breakthroughs in science or medicine. We can solve problems that people really care about. And, plenty of scholars have said that that's a sort of false equivalence, that when you build a machine that's very, very good at playing a game, all you end up with is a machine that's very, very good at playing a game and not much else. So, but there's a way of saying this is why we did this experiment. And scholars like Dana Boyd and MC Ellis have pointed out that really this is about drumming up hype and investment. These performances are very legible. I'll come back to performance again, but they artificially connect virtuosity in a very specific domain, game playing, with more general social usefulness in these narratives. And then finally, there's something that runs through all of social constructivism, which is this idea of how you connect, how you get to people's sort of social desires and their sort of social desires and anxieties through a technology. So this is Anthony Ems talking about psychotechnologies, brain reading technologies, in other words. The development of new technologies is not only driven by specific needs, but also tends to express or embody more abstract social desires. Inventors and producers often use impossible fantasies or enchantments to promote public acceptance of new technologies and conceal their potentially disastrous side effects. And again, there's litanies of scholars who pointed out that on one hand you've got someone saying it's going to solve climate change, it's going to lead to new sciences, it's going to eradicate poverty, while at the same time having this enormous energy cost, resulting in greater inequality, exploiting intellectual property, so on and so forth. So using the weight of those really complex, heavy, and very real social and planetary problems as as a speculative, because those are speculative solutions, they don't exist, as a speculative offset to the very real negative damage that these things are doing. This is a great example from Sam Altman's The Intelligence Age that he released after the success of ChatGPT, where he sort of, again, associates what now is quite a rudimentary chatbot with the idea of fixing the climate, establishing a space colony, the discovery of all physics eventually becoming commonplace, with near limitless intelligence and abundant energy, the ability to generate great ideas and the ability to make them happen. We can do quite a lot. This is often also called the first step fallacy, which is again another idea from literature in the 70s and 80s, which is the idea that a small step advance in a particular direction is then extrapolated to the outcome without any consideration of everything that has to happen in between to get there. So this is again, with the little time I have trying to explore some of these ideas of how you might use critical practice. This is a project that I did with Charlie Peters and Wesley Goatley called Charismatic Megapigment, where we were very interested in some of the early computer vision well, not early, but some of the consumer computer vision technology that was available at the time, particularly for artists working with machine learning. And some of the arguments that Catherine Hales makes about where meaning is made in the interaction with a machine. So where does a human, when interacting with a machine, any sort of automated system, put sort of the point where meaning is made? And meaning is made, in the interpretation that the human being has of what's going on. So we built this robot that scans across a painting by Charlie. Charlie's a formalist painter, so she doesn't make any, there's no inherent meaning in the image at all. She's purely going on sort of instinct. And we built a machine learning system that uses a nearest neighbor match to basically match what the robot is seeing, so there's a camera on the back of the screen, to an image from 125,000 images from Google based on a search for the color green. So basically, we just put a Google image search for green and wrote a script that would just download all the images that were coming up. We got about 125,000 of them, and then it does a nearest neighbor match to that image. And there's sort of lots of things going on here. So the project's called Charismatic Megapigment because we were really interested. The exhibition it was in was about climate change and ecology and sustainability. We were very interested in greenwashing, essentially. In painting, green is a very difficult color because the only way to make it historically has been using some pretty dangerous poisons. So has historically been quite rare in its use in painting, but is now, commonplace use as a thing for as a symbolic indicator of sort of green credentials or sustainability. And lots of the images we got in that data bank are images from, corporate sustainability commitments and things like that. So they're sort of these beautiful pictures of green fields or children running through green fields or whatever it is that are celebrating sustainability, which are then devoid of their context because they're in this image bank and then reprojected back onto this painting that also has no meaning. So, the sort of very simple and quite childish purpose of this work was to sort of have people, interact with it and explore it and observe it and try and as they're doing that, everyone's trying to unpick some meaning from it and trying to find some kind of what's it doing and why is it doing? What does it produce by doing this? And actually, the point is nothing. It's all of these arbitrary, meaningless connections that are purely symbolic and representative between the machine learning, between the representation of the color green to be equated with sustainability, between the painting that has no inherent meaning, in which people are searching for some semblance of meaning amongst these arbitrary symbols that are just associated by pattern recognition. So the second chapter is on spectacle, performance, and demonstration. And this is perhaps one of the most well fleshed out ideas, I think. So we can go all the way back to the beginning of modernism and Western science and Hobbes's work, for instance, on the critique of like the performance of science, to show that in settings, H.M. Collins calls them epidictic displays. So basically, we have these things that happen in AI quite a lot, like product demonstrations, that are dressed up as if they're scientific, as if they are evidence, as if they're experimental in some way or another. But the experimenter has almost total control over the representation and the context. So this is an example from Google last year, where they were demonstrating what they claim was some breakthroughs in live object and image recognition from a large language model from an AI, and it turned out to be completely faked. The machine couldn't do it at all. They'd staged it and sort of edited it to make it look like it was doing this quite remarkable object recognition and differentiation, which it wasn't at all. But this was enabled by the fact that the product demo, the video, was dressed up as if it was science. They had like subheadings that appeared showing the different experiments. They had sort of control setups with like images of ducks and models of ducks and actual ducks, well, photographs of ducks and things like that, to have this sort of veneer of like, this is a scientific process, when in fact it's all sort of dressed up as, it's all in fact a product demo that's been carefully edited to appeal to investors and potential customers. Similarly, back to games again, and games have an incredibly fascinating history in AI and computer science generally. These displays of, again, virtuosity, epidictic performance, where in the case of IBM, they did beat Garry Kasparov in 1997 at chess, and again, Google's DeepMind beat Lee Sedol in 2016 at Go. There's two things happening here which are really interesting. The first is how much DeepMind want you to associate what they do with the very famous story of IBM's Deep Blue. So the setup is the same, the sort of structure of even the layout of the room is the same, the coverage and the way it's talked about is very similar. They try and position their work on what Bogdan Aromich calls a trans-historical continuity. So there's this sort of inevitable path of AI development, on which, near the beginning there is IBM and Deep Blue, and now we're the inheritors of that legacy. We're going a step further by playing Go. They make careful points in the documentary to point out how much more complex Go is than chess. But they, again, frame it in very similar terms as overcoming this incredible adversity. As many people have pointed out, what really happened here is a multi-billion-dollar corporation beat one Korean man at a game. That's sort of actually what happened. It wasn't some, it wasn't some David and Goliath story, as it's very well framed in the documentary. I should add my standard disclaimer here about DeepMind. The DeepMind do really genuinely incredible scientific work, particularly on chemical engineering and molecular biology and things like that. DeepMind are definitely on the right side of history in my mind as far as their AI research work goes. I just think AlphaGo, and by their own admission, interestingly, Demis Hassabis has done interviews since where he talks about how AlphaGo was a real dead end for them. It was an interesting thing to drum up public hype, but in terms of the science it produced, it was really, really limited. So even they admit that it was a hype machine rather than genuine scientific progress. And I mentioned epidictic displays earlier from H.M. Collins. So epidictic displays are exhibitions of technical virtuosity used by those who have control over the experimental design. And he talks a lot about things like plane crash tests where they are able to frame safety in a very particular way. This is another example that I study quite a lot. And again, there's huge amounts to say about this. There's 2 hours of material just about this particular 20-minute event. This was the appearance of Ada, and apparently described as the first robot or AI artist, I think, first AI artist, at the House of Lords in the UK in October 2022 in front of a committee talking about the future of creativity and digital technology in the UK. And again, the whole thing is an epidictic display. It's very rare that you have so much press drawn to a House of Lords hearing before the event itself, maybe after if there's some particular controversy. But in the days leading up to this, they had press releases. They were really excited. The investment on the part of the UK government here is that the UK, about 2 or 3 months earlier, just released their AI strategy, penned by disgraced politicians Kwasi Kwarteng and Nadine Dorries. And there was this positioning of the UK as a sort of tech, a tech place where companies can invest. And to be fair, it does have a lot of AI investment and tech investment. So on the part of the government, this was performing, being future facing and being really interested and innovative and risk taking in technology. And for Aidan Mellor, who's the chap sat to the left there of Ada, it's just sort of showcasing his technology in this particular site of power. In lots of interesting writing about the social constructivism, there's been more recent attention drawn to the fact that the amount of power that actors have has a much more significant role than the technology itself. So in this case, Aidan Mellor is very well connected with the art world and the art community. The House of Lords obviously is, the UK government. They're able to activate the press. They're able to draw attention from the media. They have cameras that are in the room all the time anyway. They're able to broadcast it, record it, put it on YouTube. So they're able to activate this particular imaginary much better. But actually, when you look through the story of the event itself, it's really kind of prosaic and sad. So they're allegedly interviewing this robot about its position on the future of creativity in the UK. However, because the robot is so sort of flawed, it has to give pre-recorded answers. So they don't even have it working at the time. And I actually wrote that, you might as well just have a laptop on the table and press play and play a couple of MP3s, because that's effectively what it's doing. There's also the very particular way that Ada is designed, and this is not uncommon for these kind of bots that you see increasingly. There's other ones like Sophie and God, there's another one I've forgotten the name of, but these sort of bots that appear at quite a lot of these public events. They're all female. They're always designed to be feminine, to play into the sort of gender and sexual politics of robots and machines, obviously. In this particular instance, Ada is also dressed in quite a juvenile way. So there are other representations of Ada at like Basel Art Fair and stuff, where it's like in a full ball gown and dressed up as quite a glamorous figure. In this case, it's made to look quite juvenile and childish, which I think is a purposeful decision to make it more forgiving and make people more sympathetic with it. It also has its arms exposed. So, they are showcasing the fact that it's a machine underneath. They don't need to do that. They could have put long sleeves on, or as with the head and the upper body, they could have put latex skin over it, but they decided not to play into this idea. It's a prototype, which Catherine Hales again has shown. No, sorry, Lucy Suckman has shown makes people more sympathetic and forgiving of machines when they appear to be works in progress and incomplete in some way or another. So lots of, again, design decisions made to socially construct a particular idea of what AI is in this particular context. It also draws on science fiction quite heavily, and a lot of these things do. So the most common interaction that most people have had hitherto with ideas of AI and robots is through science fiction generally. So either through film or TV or books or video games, whatever. So you could take the Bicentennial Man, where the character appears to defend its humanity in front of this world council, as a sort of, you know, very similar setting that people would be familiar with, and makes this setting more digestible because they've seen this before. If not Bicentennial Man, there are things in Star Trek involving data, all sorts of stuff. So science fiction plays an incredibly important role. This is a project I did in 2018. I was asked by a design museum to submit a design I thought would be the thing that would be most significant over the next 50 years. I can't remember the exact time frame. And this was just about the release of the Synthesizing Obama project from Washington University, which was a pretty breakthrough project where scientists managed to train, you know, what today we wouldn't blink an eye at, but scientists have managed to train a machine learning system on the speeches of Barack Obama, so they could reproduce Barack Obama's facial movements and bodily movements and voice for any text it was given. And in 2018, this was pretty wild, and I was quite convinced it was going to be significant. But actually, then I, being a critical technical practitioner, looked into the actual construction of the thing itself, explored the construction of the Python that's behind it, which is mostly from like open and shared libraries with a couple of additional bits, and then printed it on these massive acrylic tablets to make this thing that would otherwise be quite ephemeral or bewitching or spectacular in one way or another quite normal and boring. You know, it's actually not that much code in the first place, as we now know. The place where value is stored in these systems isn't in the algorithm or the code, if you like, it's in the data, in the training data. So that's what, you know, I couldn't get hold of, because there's like gigabytes and terabytes of training data. But it was a way of despectacularizing it, moving away from the sort of shock that people were experiencing when seeing this project, and making it something that was quite mundane and boring, and grounded and physical as well, and talking about the physical weight of these systems, which I think we're a lot more conscious of now than we were in 2018. Picking up the pace a bit because I'm already over time. Last bit, enchantment, the uncanny, and the sublime. So this is some of the ideas around how how these strange, offsetting, slightly uncanny experiences help to socially construct AI and affect our interpretation and impression of it. So, I mean, enchantment is a very particular term that I don't really have time to go into in depth, but borrowing from Alfred Gell's definition, that it's the perception of something more than human in the construction of something. So Gell looks particularly like religious artwork, and sort of examines how, because of its technical accomplishment, people will see in it the hand of like a spiritual being, because it appears to be something that they can't empathize with making themselves, whether it's a stained glass window or an incredible carving or whatever it is. So it's coming from that sort of definition of enchantment, these things that appear to be otherworldly in some way or another. I can't remember why I put this in here. I mean, this is Ellis and Boyd again, talking about the idea that I think the really important thing to bear in mind, and I would make clear that my thesis is only about AI because it's a useful metaphor. Really, it's about how we generally socially construct technologies and futures. And very much in AI, as going back to that initial part about use, usefulness, and users, the story of AI is always one of becoming, right? It's always in the future. It's always what's next. It's always like, this isn't quite the final thing, but in the next breakthrough, we'll have this. In the next breakthrough, we'll get that. It's all a future-oriented practice. It's never complete. So it always relies on the potential of the technology rather than what it can actually do now. I still haven't figured out how to interpret these. I think this is a very particular thing to AI that's been emerging recently, is these great big sort of multi 10,000 word manifestos from people involved in the development of generative AI at the moment. So you've got Leopold Aschenbrenner's situational awareness, which was quite famous last year, largely because it was bogus and made up crap. But sort of saying how close we were to AGI is going to come any day. Dario Amadei is quite good. Machines of Loving Grace, talking about his sort of vision for Anthropic and the future of AI. And then more recently, this, again, as a foresight professional, quite bogus AI 2027 prediction that came out earlier, maybe even just a few weeks ago. But there's something really interesting about this being a form that people are descending into for future making. So these long, multi-10,000 word essays, prioritizing the authorship and individual presence of the genius behind them. They're always presented in serif font as well, which I think is like trying to give them some political weight, as if like the authors think that by putting them in Georgia or Garamond, they'll be taken more seriously than if they did them in Roboto. I'm not sure what that decision's about, but as someone with a bachelor's in typography, I find it really interesting. So this is a space of future making, and kind of enchantment is really interesting. There are all these stories about how amazing the future is going to be and how we're going to get there that are emerging as part of the enchantment. There's also then how the machines are represented themselves. This is again a still from AlphaGo, the documentary by DeepMind. I don't know why it says 2020. It was 2017, the documentary. Whenever they talk about the AI, they usually show this shot. So, Act 2, the bulk of the film is about the game against Lee Sedol. And obviously they're talking, about this vast and complex machine that they built at the time in 2016, 9 years ago. But they keep showing this laptop as if it's like a kooky little friend that they've got. They keep like zooming into this like little thing that's again like going to some of the aesthetics of prototyping and being a bit unfinished and being a work in progress to try and make it more sympathetic. They very rarely show, the enormous building at King's Cross where this was actually made, and there's like, 1,000 people who work there, on massive server racks and complex computer science over there. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. I'm going to pick up the speed a bit. And there's something in here about the enchantment of computation more generally. So in other forums, I've looked at the history of different types of computational technologies and how they've become sources of enchantment. William Stahl's Venerating the Black Box is one of the best pieces of work on this, where he talks about how in the 1980s, with the beginning of the PC, the computer becomes like a talisman for power. So through media coverage, through the coverage of the people inventing the PC, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, it becomes an object of power. It itself becomes almost imbued with potential, right? So, you can think about, in a design sense, the post-war boom in the so-called developed world results in all these new technologies entering the home, the fridge, the microwave, the toaster. Toasters already existed, fridges, microwaves, washing machines, etc. Those objects' forms reflects their function, right? Fridges are cold because they keep things cold. Microwaves warm things up. But a computer doesn't really have a particular function because it can do so many things. It can do maths, it can write, it can play video games. By the end of the 1980s, you can connect it to the internet. So its form is sort of amorphous to its function or untethered to its function. And so it becomes this more abstract thing of like, it's a device of power. It's a device of control and power and efficiency and speed and things like that. And then I really need to pick up the pace. I'm gonna maybe skip a slide or two. This is very much about how the enchantment in AlphaGo, and this happens all the time. You can look at any other examples. Whenever a challenge or a benchmark is set for AI, the benchmark itself has to be enchanted. So in the case of AlphaGo, it's the game of Go. It's beyond human. It takes a certain type of genius. Demis Hassabis in the film says there are more Go moves than there are atoms in the universe. It is the benchmark itself is enchanted as being beyond human capability. Then the computer wins or beats the benchmark or whatever it is. And then the computer itself is going, oh my God, well, now the computer must be enchanted. The computer must have this way of seeing the world and appreciating the world that we can't comprehend. So the enchantment moves from the benchmark to the computer itself. And Kate Crawford's written quite a lot about that. I'm going to skip through the magic stuff. I've done huge amounts of work on this already through the Haunted Machines projects as well, I mentioned, but the association of magic with computational technology and AI is not an accident. Magic is a causeless technology. You push a button or you do a ritual and get a thing, and it's a very useful metaphorical framework for explaining the same kind of process. In the words of Elish and Boyd again, it's a way to express praise while also reinforcing a sense that how the technology works is unknowable and inscrutable. And so even if you look at coverage of, again, your Bill Gateses, your Steve Jobs, even your Elon Musks or whatever, they are also dressed up in magical terms, right? They're sages or they're evangelists or They have some secret power and some secret vision that is inaccessible to the rest of us. So there's also a power dynamic at play in the use of magical terminology, which isn't purposeful necessarily. And I'm gonna skip through the last project and finish there. And I'm sorry I went over too long and probably talked too fast. And I imagine most of you, your first language isn't English, and for that I can only apologize. Not that your first language isn't English, that's probably good.
Thank you so much, Tobias, and no worries about the time. Okay, I will. I want to touch on the topic of enchantment first. This is something you touched on a lot throughout your presentation today, and it's been something you've worked on for a long time. And so it becomes clear technology, on the one hand, constantly is presented as a magical entity. On the other hand, technology historically has also promoted the process of disenchantment. It helped move from a religious to a scientific worldview. And yeah, I'm very interested in how you approach this tension conceptually and how you navigate it through the lens of critical design, and perhaps also how you got interested in this topic in the first place.
Well, to answer the last part first, it was through some of the exploration of magic and the occult. So I mentioned Haunted Machines, which is a project that began in about 2014, when everyone was raging about the Internet of Things. Remember that? That was a good time. And a lot of the terminology coming out, and I was in the design and tech world, a lot of the terminology was occult. It was talking about the magic powers and connection, and it was using this sort of language of the occult. And so that kicked off Haunted Machines in 2014, and we did a bunch of events. We ran a festival in Utrecht in the Netherlands in 2017, and wrote a bunch of essays and articles and things like that. And so we came across the idea of enchantment there again through Alfred Gell's work largely, which is the framework of enchantment I take, which is this idea that he looks at religious artwork, as I said, and objects that appear to have such remarkable technical execution, and particularly religious artworks traditionally, are given that association because they seem to be beyond the capability of normal human production. And so in the case of computational technology and technology more generally, enchantment occurs when something amazing happens, right? And Belk, I think Belk, has written about how in the release of any new technology, there's this sort of 5-stage cycle of novelty and enchantment. So novelty is a really important part. It has to be new, has to do something that no one's ever seen before. And that creates a sense of enchantment because everybody's trying to wonder how it works and unpick it and how it's doing what it's doing in some way or another. Once that's happened and it's normalized, it doesn't necessarily become disenchanted, but it becomes normalized. The disenchantment happens when something that has previously been enchanted has that enchantment taken away from it. So this is sort of delving into an idea I have, which is a little less founded, which is, I suppose, one of the questions I've been asking and talking to lots of peers in this area about is why, with the generative AI cycle of the last few years, have the benchmarks all been around creativity? Like, why have they been writing art, music, video, etc., etc.? And this is maybe, again, it's sort of a subjective assessment. I'm interested if anyone has any other ideas, but I think it's because there's a fundamental nihilism in it. I think there's a worldview at play there, which is written about, and you can read it in Sam Altman's work or Leopold Aschenbrenner's work, which is that everything is computable, right? Is that anything in the known universe can be calculated or simulated in a computer. We just need the right amount of power to do it. That's the sort of underlying philosophy or ideology or worldview that a lot of people developing AI have. So that's true. That's documented because they write about it and they say, yeah, like we'll be able to do, once we have computers powerful enough, we'll be able to solve all healthcare, all education, all social problems. So they believe that computation is the key to everything. And so it is in your interest, if that's your worldview, to prove that there is nothing enchanted about creativity. Because we do, and I'm coming from a Western mindset, we do revere in a different way creatives, right? Great musicians, great artists, great writers, so on and so forth. And we imbue them with a particular talent that is kind of is incalculable, right? It's not something you can simulate or reduce to a computer in some way or another. And so if your worldview is that everything is calculatable, then an obvious thing to go after to prove that worldview is the stuff that hitherto people have thought is enchanted because it has this particular supernatural talent or power behind it. And so that's, I think that's part of the thing, is to disenchant it. And I think the other week, I'm sure many of you saw, I was actually at Cambridge doing a talk about this stuff. Right as this happened, there was the thing about OpenAI releasing a new image generator that could replicate Studio Ghibli, and of course Miyazaki, is it Hideo Miyazaki? Anyway, Miyazaki, the founder of Ghibli, has been quite vocal about his anti-AI views and about the craft he imbues in the work of the studio. And I don't think you do that by accident, right? I just don't think that happens by accident. It might happen by carelessness, but I think you sort of go, well, let's prove him wrong. I think at some point that decision is made to say, well, we'll prove him wrong. Whether that is done out of a sort of sense of humor or carelessness, I don't think these people are like, nefarious bad guys in a cave and conspiracy theories. I just think, the things that we hitherto have considered to be enchanted or somehow beyond computability, they want to prove are computable. And this is why games are much more documented, because there's a longer history of computers trying to use games as benchmarks. And again, there's lots of great reasons for that. One of the reasons is that games are very understandable benchmarks for a general public. They're not abstract. You either win or lose a game. It's quite easy to get a press article out there about a breakthrough if you've won a game. But the other fact, again, is that particularly in chess, and Nathan Ensmerger has written about this a lot, chess is associated with some sort of like, I'm not going to say superhuman, but like certainly a pinnacle of like intellectual and strategic achievement to be a great chess player throughout history, and associated with, yeah, I don't know what to say, like virtuosity and yeah, and I don't know another way of putting it, but and so again, disenchanting that and sort of saying, no, it's not that special. It's just maths. It's just hard computation, and we can do it. Is a way of enchanting the machine and moving that enchantment over to the machine.
Okay, thank you. Another topic I'd like to touch on is the role of AI as a future-making agent. So you've spoken about and shown how AI is constructed to be an agent of the future, AI here being kind of a stand-in for technology more generally, perhaps.
Yeah.
In hand with this comes the idea that technology itself is determining the future and in some sense foreclosing it. I'd be interested to hear more about your views on what critical design approaches, whether they are participatory, speculative, or perhaps ecological, might contribute to contesting this narrative of inevitability.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, even beyond those ones, there's great practices in decolonial design, in design justice, in queer practices as well, that are all doing the same thing. And so within, I'm just going to show you, because why not? Within my thesis, I don't know. You're a PhD student, Nicholas. I don't know how you're going about it. I'm always really interested to hear. I have to do my PhD part-time, so I do my PhD between 5 and 6:30 a.m. before my kid wakes up, and then I have to go and do my day job. So I have built quite a sort of rigorous way of structuring my thoughts, and one of them is building a categorization system of different critical practices that I've been exploring, and different strategies that critical practice takes. So there's some really interesting paradoxes in critical practice. Maria Luce Lupetti and Dave Murray Ross have written some great work about different critical and speculative approaches to AI, because you can go down a speculative, here's an alternative route. You can go down a sort of tracing route where you're saying, let's expose some of the inequities and problems in them. Lots of great work on the biases in data sets from queer practitioners, for example, in that space. I think one of the challenges is, and this has always been a challenge of critical practice, is getting those in front of the right audience to really make a difference. And I think the history of critical and speculative design, at least from the UK and a little bit from the American world, but mostly from the UK world, has been that you train a generation of designers to just see the world in a more critical way. So as they go to Google and they build AI products, they are not necessarily doing critical design, but they are thinking critically about their role as designers in different ways. But let me show you this thing. Sorry, my app has just loaded up properly. One second, let me share my screen again. Boop, 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 boop. Where has it gone? Where's Zoom? There we go. Sorry, I'm on a laptop in a small meeting room because I have a shared office space and I couldn't get one of the good meeting rooms. So I use Obsidian to like plan my life and all my ideas. I don't know if any of you know this, but it's basically like an open source way of building your own wiki, essentially is probably the best way of describing it. So my PhD is like broken down into these big buckets called concepts. Whereas I'm reading things, I sort of, so yeah, for instance, here's a concept. You can see actually somewhere in here should be the whole thing. This is a concept on heteromation. So the idea that automation is a bit of a myth, that actually what happens is that humans end up doing work to make computational systems work. But even within critical strategies, I've started to come up with these different approaches that different types of practice use to engage for different reasons. So, there's absurdity, which is making fun of things. Lots of great examples of projects where they're sort of making fun of some of the proclivities of AI and the way it works and some of the cultures around it. There's dissonance, which is maybe exploring some of the inconsistencies. And I love this project. I'm actually writing about this one at the moment called Niloid, which is not really a project about AI at all, but it's a large kinetic installation of something that's clearly a machine, but makes you feel like it's alive. And I'm really interested in that. Sherry Turkle's written a lot about this as well, the difference between knowing and feeling when interacting with a machine. Like, it's a machine, but you might feel it's not. And how do you reconcile those things? And if you can't reconcile them, how can you use them to explore critical practice in people? Exploits, so hacking, essentially, frictions, participatory methods. This is maybe more personal again and subjective, but I personally have my concerns about participatory methods. There's a critique of critical and speculative practice, which is that it's designed for designers. And I'm like, yeah, fine. Okay. It doesn't have to be for everybody. It can just be to help designers do better design. It doesn't have to be for wide scale public engagement. And my experience of when I've used participatory methods over the last decade plus, and particularly in like professional and commercial settings, is very often you end up with like the least offensive output. Because you just end up with the thing that everyone's least unhappy with. Again, I'm maybe thinking about commercial work more than critical work. And often I think it's much more effective to do something that just upsets people and does, then, but as long as you do that in a safe way, where it's a safe and sort of and well-supported environment where people can be challenged for their beliefs or assumptions, and then you can, have a structured walk through the result of that upset, that's fine. I think upsetting people for the sake of it is no good. And it's some of the problems I've had with some of the practices I've come across is that they just, make a big upsetting statement and then don't do anything to help people through that process. And then, you've obviously got things like speculation, which is perhaps the most well-known. So how can we expose some of the things that we take for granted now about how we're doing AI by looking at how AI might be done so indigenous protocol is a great example. Slow AI, which is a sort of growing movement, that how might we use AI to live slower rather than faster? So pushing back on the ideas of speeds, efficiency, productivity, and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And I think as a designer, I'm trying to remember your question properly, but as a designer, I think it's sort of saying, well, you approach it as a design project. Who's the audience and what's the impact you want to have? And then build the appropriate set of methods and tools based on that. I think that's the best way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. We make a point here. Again, thank you very much for your presentation.